The morning sun had barely kissed the horizon when the cowboy stirred from his worn bed. The cabin, modest and weathered, creaked under the weight of years exposed to wind, rain, and relentless sun. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the small window, painting the room in golden streaks. The air smelled faintly of leather, wood smoke, and the lingering scent of horses. He yawned, stretching his long arms, and glanced around the cabin, noting the quiet stillness that had become a constant companion. For years this was how he lived, alone with only the ranch and his animals for company. The cowboy's life had been shaped by solitude, not by choice, but by circumstance. Friends had moved on, family ties had frayed, and losses had carved invisible scars across his heart. He had loved once long ago, only to watch that love dissolve under the harsh realities of frontier life. Now, the silence of the wide-open plains was both a comfort and a weight. It reminded him that he could rely on no one but himself. He dressed in simple, rugged clothes, a faded flannel shirt, heavy trousers, and boots worn thin at the heels. The leather of his belt had softened over time, molded to fit the curve of his waist, and his hat bore the imprint of countless storms endured. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of dew and distant rain. The cowboy's eyes, sharp and gray, scanned the horizon as he stepped out onto the creaking porch. He could feel the tension in the air. The clouds overhead were darker than usual, threatening a storm. His morning routine was methodical. First, he tended to the horses, brushing their coats and checking their hooves for stones or injuries. Then he moved to the cattle, inspecting fences and ensuring the livestock were safe. Each task was done with care, a rhythm that brought him a sense of purpose. He knew every inch of his land, every rise and dip in the terrain, every hidden stream and shaded grove. It was a life built on hard work and quiet observation, but it was lonely. The evenings, when the sun sank behind the distant mountains, were particularly difficult. That's when memories of what he had lost crept in, the family he might have had, the friends he had once counted on. Yet, even in his isolation, the cowboy was known among the nearby townsfolk. Reliable, steady, and fair-minded, he had a reputation for helping others without seeking recognition. A lost calf? He'd track it down. A fence broken by wind? He'd fix it without complaint. People respected him, though few ever lingered long enough to know the man behind the work-worn face. He didn't mind. Loneliness, after all, was easier than betrayal. As the morning progressed, the first drops of rain began to fall, gentle at first, then heavier, striking the tin roof with a steady rhythm. The cowboy paused, squinting through the sheets of rain, feeling the storm pressing down on the wide plains. There was a restlessness in the air, a sense that something unusual was coming. He adjusted his hat and tightened his coat, the muscles in his arms tense with anticipation. Though he did not yet know it, the storm would bring more than rain. It would bring change, and with it, a stranger who would alter the course of his quiet, solitary life forever. For now he rode the familiar paths of his land, the thunder rolling in the distance like a warning. The wind tugged at the trees, and the smell of wet earth filled his senses. The cowboy's heart, steady and controlled, beat with a hint of expectation. Life on the ranch had always been predictable, but the horizon promised that today the rules of his solitude might be challenged. And deep down, though he would not admit it aloud, a part of him, buried under years of routine and quiet resignation, was ready for it. By mid-morning, the sky had transformed into a restless, brooding expanse. Clouds stacked upon one another like dark, rolling mountains, blotting out the sun and casting the plains in a gray, uneasy light. The wind picked up, rattling the wooden shutters of the cabin and bending the tall grasses in long, fluid waves. The cowboy paused in his chores, squinting into the distance. He could feel the tension in the air, that electric anticipation that always preceded a storm on the frontier. Something about the weight of it made his chest tighten. He moved quickly, securing loose tools and reinforcing the fences against the wind. The ranch, normally a haven of order and routine, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. Thunder rumbled far off, a low growl that vibrated through the earth. The cowboy's boots sank slightly in the damp soil as he worked, each step deliberate. He knew the storm would not wait for him to finish his chores, and he had learned long ago that nature would take no excuses. Lightning flashed on the horizon, sharp and blinding, followed by the roll of thunder that seemed to chase it across the sky. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, the leather damp from the mist forming on the rising wind. There was a rawness to the air, a charged energy that made his senses feel alive and alert. He glanced down the winding dirt road that led off the ranch, noticing how the trees bowed under the force of the gusts. Somewhere beyond the hills, the rain would soon fall in sheets, relentless and unyielding. As he moved toward the barn to shelter the horses, a sudden movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it was the wind, bending the branches just so, but then he saw a figure stumbling along the fence line. The cowboy squinted, his instincts immediately alert. The shape of a person appeared, hunched and struggling against something unseen. Even from a distance, he could tell that the figure was small and vulnerable, fighting against whatever force held them back. His heart tightened. Out here, alone on the plains, danger came in many forms, and a person abandoned in the storm was no match for its fury. The rain began in earnest, first as a soft patter, then as a steady drumming that soaked the earth and hissed off the rooftops. The cowboy's horse snorted nervously as the wind whipped through its mane, and he gripped the reins tightly. Without hesitation, he spurred the horse forward, heading toward the struggling figure. Every second felt amplified. The wind screamed in his ears, and the storm seemed to press down on him from all sides. He could now see the figure clearly, a young woman, her clothes soaked and clinging to her body, her hair plastered to her face. She was tied to a fence post, and every attempt she made to free herself only tightened her bonds. Anger and disbelief surged through the cowboy. Who could be cruel enough to leave a girl like this, alone and defenseless, in the path of an approaching storm? He didn't wait to think. He swung off his horse, splashing through the mud, and ran to her side. His hands worked quickly, cutting the ropes and pulling her free. She collapsed into his arms, trembling from cold and fear. He held her tightly, shielding her from the wind and rain, whispering reassurances she couldn't hear over the storm, but that somehow mattered all the same. For the first time that day, the cowboy felt a shift in his solitude. The storm was not just outside. It had found its way to the heart of his quiet life. And as he guided her through the mud and toward the relative safety of his cabin, he knew that neither of them would ever be the same again. The cabin door slammed behind them, rattling the thin wooden walls as the cowboy set the girl down near the hearth. The fire had already been kindled earlier in anticipation of the storm, and its warmth was almost shocking against the chill that clung to her skin. Water dripped from her hair and clothes, pooling onto the rough-hewn floorboards. She shivered violently, teeth chattering, eyes wide and wary. The cowboy, sensing her fear, knelt beside her, his hands steady but gentle. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm, firm, and reassuring. "You're out of the storm. That's what matters." The girl stared at him, the storm outside matching the turmoil in her own mind. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, not from exertion but from a combination of cold, fear, and disbelief. She had expected the wind and rain to be the worst part of the day. She hadn't expected a stranger to find her, to care enough to cut her free from the cruel ropes that had bound her. The cowboy quickly set about gathering dry blankets and a spare coat, wrapping her tightly and trying to bring warmth back to her body. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but he remained careful not to overwhelm her. In situations like this, he had learned it was trust and patience, not force, that made the difference. Why would he? Her voice trembled, but she couldn't finish the sentence. Her father's name, bitter and sharp, stuck in her throat. She dared not speak it aloud. The cowboy did not press. He understood without being told. Some stories revealed themselves in time, and some people needed space before they could speak. Instead, he handed her a cup of warm tea made from herbs he had kept for just such emergencies. The steam curled up into the air, and she inhaled it, letting the warmth seep into her frozen limbs. "You're wet to the bone," he said. "Sit by the fire. Let the warmth get to your muscles." He watched as she hesitated for a moment, then cautiously lowered herself onto the rug, close enough to the fire but still distant, like a small bird unsure of the hand reaching toward it. The cowboy's eyes, usually reserved and steady, softened as he looked at her. There was a resilience there, beneath the fear and trembling, a spark that hadn't been extinguished by cruelty or neglect. She was young, yes, but she had survived far too much to let despair claim her entirely. He could see it in the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her soaked clothing, in the way she flinched at every gust of wind that rattled the cabin, and yet remained determined to keep herself upright. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. "We'll need to get you out of those wet clothes and into something dry." She nodded slowly, though her legs shook under her. The cowboy helped her up, steadying her as they made their way to a small chamber where spare clothes were kept. As he handed her a simple dress and a woolen undershirt, she paused, glancing at him with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked, voice small and wary. The cowboy paused, considering how to answer. Truthfully, it was instinct, not philosophy. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "No one deserves to be left out in the storm tied to a fence." He met her gaze steadily. "You don't have to thank me." For the first time that day, a small flicker of relief crossed her face. She didn't trust easily, not after everything she had endured, but there was a promise in his calm, steady presence, a promise that she might just be safe, at least for now. And as the rain hammered against the roof and the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin, the two of them began the tentative process of trust, a fragile bond forming in the warmth of the fire, one that would be tested in the days to come. The first night in the cabin was long and uneasy. The storm raged outside, wind shrieking through the gaps in the wooden walls, and rain slamming against the roof like a drumbeat of urgency. The girl stayed huddled on the small cot near the fire, her body wrapped in the blankets the cowboy had given her. She was safe, yes, but safety didn't erase fear, and it certainly didn't erase years of mistrust. Every shadow cast by the fire, every creak of the cabin, set her nerves on edge. The cowboy, meanwhile, moved quietly around the cabin, performing his usual nightly tasks, but with one eye always on her. He had seen enough of human suffering to recognize that fear needed patience, not words, and that trust could only be earned slowly. He didn't ask her questions that might force answers she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he worked in quiet, letting her observe that he posed no threat, that his care was steady and unwavering. "You can stay here tonight," he said gently, noticing her tense posture. "The fire's warm and there's food on the table. Eat when you feel ready." She stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together, a frown creasing her forehead. She wanted to say something sharp, maybe even unkind, but no words came. She had been abandoned and hurt so many times that caution had become a survival instinct. To trust a stranger, no matter how kind, was dangerous. Her silence was both defense and test. The cowboy didn't push. Instead, he sat nearby, sharpening his knife while keeping a steady gaze on her, not in a threatening way, but as a presence she could rely on. The small sounds of his work, the scrape of metal against stone, the soft hum of concentration, were oddly comforting. And slowly she began to relax, just enough to nibble at the bread and cheese he offered. She kept her distance, but the fact that she ate it all was a small victory. Hours passed. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and with it, the girl's defenses began to falter under the warmth and steady kindness of the cowboy. She ventured closer to the fire, letting the heat seep into her chilled bones. She spoke in fragments, testing the waters, sharing little details about herself, her name, the farm she had lived on, and the storm that had left her tied to the fence. Every word was measured, cautious, yet it was a start. The cowboy listened, responding not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. He shared small pieces of his own story, the kind that revealed enough to show he was human and trustworthy without burdening her with unnecessary details. He spoke of the land, the cattle, and the solitude he had grown accustomed to. He didn't try to fix her, and he didn't force her to speak. He merely existed as a reliable presence, a steady anchor in the chaos of her mind. By the time the storm began to lessen, a tentative truce had been formed. She still flinched at sudden noises and kept her distance, but she no longer recoiled at his touch or words. She allowed him to help her wash off the grime of the day, and she let him guide her to a bed prepared with dry blankets. For the first time in a long while, she fell asleep without fear gnawing at her, though the events of the day lingered in her dreams. The cowboy, sitting quietly by the dying fire, allowed himself a small sigh. He knew that the road ahead would be long. Trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt in a single night. But there was hope now, fragile and flickering like the flames before him. And sometimes hope was enough to begin. Morning arrived with a tentative calm, the storm having finally passed, leaving the air crisp and the earth smelling of wet grass and soil. The sun struggled through lingering clouds, casting pale beams across the cabin. The girl, now somewhat rested, sat by the window, her gaze wandering across the wide plains. For the first time since the storm, she felt a quiet sense of relief, but also uncertainty. The cowboy had given her shelter, warmth, and safety, but the shadows of her past remained, tucked deep in her memory. The cowboy entered the cabin with a soft creak of the door, holding a pot of steaming coffee. He placed it on the small table, then sat opposite her. There was a careful silence between them, a space that invited conversation without forcing it. After a long pause, the girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he drinks. He never cared much for me. Sometimes he's cruel. I didn't think anyone would help me if I ran away," she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. The words came slowly, hesitantly, as if saying them aloud might make them more real. The cowboy listened quietly, his expression thoughtful but not intrusive. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer immediate solutions or advice. He understood that listening was sometimes the most powerful form of support. When she had said all she could, he finally spoke, his voice calm but tinged with the weight of experience. "I lost someone once," he said softly, his gaze drifting toward the window as if the memory played on the plains outside. "A long time ago, things went wrong. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong. Ever since, I've kept to myself. Kept distance from everyone. It's easier that way." The girl looked at him, curiosity and surprise mixing in her expression. She had expected him to be strong, maybe even stoic, but not to carry loss so quietly, so visibly. She realized that his solitude was not just habit, it was a shield. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked, hesitantly. "Aren't you lonely?" The cowboy considered her question, then smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But it's peaceful. I know what I have to do every day, and the land. The animals, they don't betray you. People, they can. But today I'm glad someone else is here," he added quietly, and for a moment the words hung in the room like fragile threads of connection. The girl shifted slightly, a small tentative smile forming. She began to see him not just as a rescuer, but as a man who carried his own scars, someone whose life, like hers, had been shaped by hardship. It made her feel less alone, less like a stranger in a harsh world. They spent the morning talking in fragments, trading stories in small doses. The cowboy told her of the ranch, how he had learned to survive the frontier, the rhythms of the land and the animals. She shared memories of her childhood, small moments of happiness before the shadow of her father had darkened her life. Each revelation, however brief, was a step toward mutual understanding. By midday, the walls of caution began to crumble slightly. Trust, once tentative and brittle, was beginning to form. The girl started to feel that she could rely on the cowboy not just for safety, but for something more elusive, compassion and understanding. And for the cowboy, watching her begin to heal and regain strength stirred something he had long buried. A protective, almost paternal instinct, coupled with a quiet hope that perhaps he wasn't meant to live entirely alone after all. In that sunlit cabin, with storm clouds fading into memory, two wounded souls began to bridge the gap between loneliness and connection. It was the beginning of a bond neither had expected, yet one that would become the anchor they both needed in the days to come. The calm after the storm lasted only a day. By the second morning, a sense of unease had settled over the ranch. The wind carried whispers from the nearby town, news traveling faster than the cowboy would have liked. Someone had spotted the girl's father, stumbling through the outskirts, his eyes bloodshot, his anger palpable. He had heard rumors that she had been found, and he was searching. The cowboy felt a familiar tension coil in his chest. He had anticipated that the girl's past wouldn't remain buried, that the consequences of her father's cruelty would follow her even to the safety of his isolated ranch. But anticipation was one thing. Imminent danger was another. He began making quiet preparations, reinforcing the fences, securing doors, and readying himself for any confrontation that might come. Out here on the plains, help from the town would take hours at best, and sometimes hours were all the difference between safety and disaster. The girl, now feeling more secure but still fragile, noticed the change in his demeanor. "Something's wrong," she said softly, worry threading her voice. She had begun to trust him, but trust also brought vulnerability, and vulnerability meant she could sense danger when it was near. Her eyes brimmed with unease as she asked, "Is it him?" The cowboy nodded, grim but composed. "He's looking for you. I don't know why, but he's dangerous when drunk, and he won't stop until he finds you. You're going to have to stay here, and I'll make sure you're safe." Fear returned to her face, a cold shadow over the fragile confidence she had begun to build. The memory of being tied to the fence and abandoned in the storm came rushing back, and she shivered. He'll hurt me again," she whispered, almost to herself. The cowboy knelt beside her, steadying her trembling hands. "Not this time," he said firmly. "I won't let him. Out here, it's my responsibility. You don't have to face him alone." His voice was calm but resolute, the kind of unwavering certainty that could inspire confidence even in someone terrified. For the next few hours, the cowboy prepared. He checked the perimeter of the property, making sure the gates were latched and the barn was secure. He armed himself with tools that could double as weapons if necessary, and he mapped the nearby escape routes should the confrontation escalate beyond control. Every action was deliberate, measured, and careful, but there was a sharp edge of tension beneath his calm exterior. The girl, meanwhile, helped where she could, carrying buckets of water and fetching firewood, learning to be useful rather than helpless. Each small task was a test of courage, a step toward reclaiming some control over her life. She began to understand that danger did not always come from nature or circumstance. Sometimes it came from the people who should have protected you, and that facing it required allies, trust, and courage. As dusk approached, the sky turned a bruised purple, shadows stretching across the ranch. They both paused to look out across the plains, knowing that tonight the father could arrive at any moment. The wind whistled through the trees like a warning. The cowboy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay close to me." No matter what happens, we face it together." In that tense twilight, the storm outside had faded, but a new storm, human and far more dangerous, was gathering. The girl, for the first time, realized that her safety depended not only on the cowboy's strength, but also on the bond they had begun to form. And the cowboy, hardened by years of solitude, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would protect her, no matter the cost, because some things were worth facing danger for, and she, fragile though she seemed, had already claimed a piece of his heart. The next few days brought a fragile calm. The threat of her father's return lingered, like a shadow at the edge of the horizon, but the immediate danger had not yet arrived. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm, and within that routine, the girl began to find a place for herself. The cowboy, ever patient, allowed her small freedoms, encouraging her to help with chores and teaching her the ways of the land. Each task, no matter how simple, became an opportunity for her to regain confidence and feel capable rather than helpless. She learned quickly, discovering the satisfaction in feeding the animals, mending fences, and gathering firewood. At first, her movements were hesitant, unsure, and cautious, as if the wind itself could betray her. But under the cowboy's quiet guidance, she began to move with purpose, her hands gaining skill and her posture a little straighter with each task completed. He never scolded her for mistakes, only offered gentle correction, and she found herself looking forward to his approval, a rare and comforting feeling. Their conversations, once hesitant and fragmented, grew more natural. Around the fire in the evenings, she shared small stories from her childhood, the games she played, the rare moments of kindness from her mother, the dreams she had once held before fear and neglect overshadowed them. He listened, asking occasional questions, revealing parts of himself in turn, how he had come to live alone, the losses he had endured, the solace he found in the land and animals that never betrayed him. Humor began to slip into their days. A clumsy stumble while carrying feed, a sudden spray from a horse as water trough, small incidents that once would have brought frustration now became moments of shared laughter. For the girl, it was the first time in years that laughter didn't feel dangerous. For the cowboy, it was the first glimpse of warmth in his quiet, lonely life. As trust grew, so did subtle signs of deeper connection. The girl would wait at the edge of the barn for him to return from the pastures, her eyes bright with curiosity and concern. He, in turn, found himself glancing her way more often than necessary, noticing the way she moved with growing confidence, how her smile came more easily, how her laughter warmed the chilly ranch mornings. But beneath the surface of this budding connection lay the constant awareness of danger. Every sound on the wind, every unfamiliar figure glimpsed in the distance reminded them both of the father still out there, searching. The cowboy, seasoned and watchful, never let his guard down, but he also refused to let fear dominate their lives. He encouraged her to embrace the ranch and its routines, showing her that strength and courage could coexist with care and trust. One evening, after a long day of chores, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the distant mountains. The girl leaned against him slightly, comforted by the warmth of his presence. I feel like I can stay here," she admitted softly. "Like I belong." The cowboy gave a faint, satisfied nod, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit, but a small smile tugged at his lips. "You do belong," he said firmly. "Out here with me. You've earned your place." In those quiet moments, amidst the ordinary work and shared silences, the bond between them deepened. The girl's confidence grew alongside her trust in him, and the cowboy's solitude softened, revealing the first traces of companionship and hope in years. Though the world outside remained uncertain, within the walls of the ranch and under the wide open sky, they had found something rare: connection, understanding, and the beginnings of family. The horizon darkened once again, not with storm clouds this time, but with the grim knowledge that the girl's father was approaching. From the barn, the cowboy spotted a familiar, staggering figure winding down the dirt road leading to the ranch. Bloodshot eyes, unsteady gait, and the unmistakable reek of alcohol told him all he needed to know. The man was angry, dangerous, and unpredictable, and he had come with a single purpose: to reclaim his daughter, no matter the cost. The cowboy moved quickly but deliberately. Every step was calculated, every tool he picked up a potential means of defense. The girl, watching from the cabin doorway, clutched a blanket to her chest, her body tense. She had grown stronger over the past days, but fear still gnawed at her, sharper now that the threat loomed so close. "Stay inside," the cowboy instructed, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, don't come out." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed the terror she felt. He gave her a reassuring nod in return, then stepped into the open yard to meet the man who had haunted her life. The father saw him and stumbled forward, rage and liquor-fueled aggression evident in every movement. "Where is she?" He slurred, voice rising with every step. "Where's my girl?" "You've had your chance," the cowboy said evenly, planting himself firmly between the man and the cabin. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man lunged, staggering but fueled by fury. The cowboy sidestepped, grabbing a sturdy wooden post from nearby. He didn't strike immediately. Instead, he used the post to block the father's wild swings and maintain a safe distance. "I'm not here to fight you for the sake of fighting," he said, voice steady. "I'm here to protect her." "Step back." For a moment, the father wavered, unsure whether to continue the attack or retreat. But anger won over reason. He advanced again, swinging erratically. The cowboy deflected each strike with calm precision, careful not to injure more than necessary, though he made it clear he would not yield. The struggle was chaotic, violent, yet controlled, one man guided by rage, the other guided by duty and strength. From the cabin, the girl watched, heart pounding. She realized the depth of the cowboy's commitment, his willingness to face danger for her sake. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of gratitude, relief, and the dawning realization that someone truly cared for her, someone who would not abandon her. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, the cowboy managed to subdue the man enough to force him backward toward the edge of the property. "Leave," he said firmly. "Go to the town if you want to live. Don't come back. You've lost this fight." The father, bruised, disoriented, and finally sober enough to see the determination in the cowboy's eyes, swayed and then turned, retreating down the dirt road, muttering curses under his breath. The danger had passed for now. The cowboy turned back to the cabin, heart still pounding from the confrontation. The girl ran into his arms, clinging to him as if she might be swept away by the relief that washed over her. You saved me," she whispered, voice choked with emotion. "I'll always protect you," he replied, holding her close. "No matter what comes." In that moment, the bond forged through storm, trust, and shared vulnerability became unbreakable. They had faced danger together, and the trials of the past had finally begun to give way to a sense of safety, companionship, and the possibility of a future together. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the ranch, but inside the cabin, warmth, relief, and the quiet promise of a new beginning settled over them both. They had survived the confrontation and in doing so had proven not just their courage but their commitment to each other. The morning after the confrontation dawned quiet and still. The storm of danger that had loomed over the ranch for days had passed, leaving a sense of cautious relief hanging in the crisp air. The father's departure had not just been a retreat. It had been a surrender. The cowboy had made it clear that he would protect the girl at any cost, and the man, humbled by confrontation and perhaps finally touched by sobriety, had no choice but to leave her behind. The girl, now wrapped in a thick blanket by the fire, felt an unfamiliar lightness. The constant fear that had shadowed her every waking moment, the fear of abandonment, of violence, of being forced back into the hands of a man who had caused her so much pain, was gone. For the first time, she could breathe without dread. The cowboy had not only saved her physically, but had begun to shield her emotionally, offering her a space to heal and reclaim her sense of self. The cowboy himself moved quietly around the cabin, repairing the damages from the past days and tending to the animals, but there was a shift in him as well. Where before there had been only duty and routine, now there was a sense of fulfillment. Protecting someone was no longer just an obligation. It had become an act of connection, a reminder that life had meaning beyond solitude. Watching the girl regain her strength and composure brought him a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Later that afternoon, news from the nearby town confirmed that the father had been apprehended by local authorities. His reputation as a drunkard and troublemaker had finally caught up with him. While justice might not erase the girl's trauma, it offered a concrete guarantee that she would not have to fear him again. The cowboy received the news with a quiet nod, not out of triumph, but as a confirmation that the threat had been neutralized. The danger that had hung over them like a storm cloud had dissipated, leaving clarity and calm in its wake. The girl, now free from the shadow of her father, began to embrace her new life on the ranch with a cautious optimism. She tended to the animals, helped with the chores, and even ventured further afield under the cowboy's watchful eye. Each small task she accomplished was a victory, a proof that she could survive and thrive outside the grip of fear. The cowboy encouraged her every step of the way, never demanding, never rushing, but always present as a steady support. In the evenings, as the sun set behind the rolling hills, they would sit together on the porch, sharing quiet conversation or comfortable silence. Trust, once fragile and tentative, had grown resilient. Fear had been replaced by security, and uncertainty had been replaced by the warmth of companionship. Their bond, forged through storm, danger, and patience, had solidified into something enduring, a mutual respect and care that promised not just survival, but a life worth living. By nightfall, the ranch itself seemed to breathe easier. The animals moved calmly in their pens, the fences stood firm, and the cabin glowed with light and warmth. The girl's laughter, soft but genuine, filled the spaces that had once echoed with solitude. And the cowboy, sitting beside her, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The threat was gone, and in its absence, something new had begun. The possibility of hope, of healing, and of a shared future. The past, with its shadows and pain, had been acknowledged and confronted. Now, they could step forward together, no longer defined by fear, but by the bond that had grown stronger with every trial they had faced. The days that followed were filled with quiet transformation. The storm of fear, danger, and uncertainty that had once dominated the girl's life had finally passed, leaving room for growth, trust, and connection. The ranch, which had always been a place of routine and solitude, now hummed with life in a different way. Every corner held a small victory. The repaired fences, the animals thriving under care, and the girl's laughter echoing through the fields. The cowboy and the girl settled into a rhythm that felt natural, each learning from the other. She had gained confidence not only in her ability to navigate the physical demands of ranch life, but also in her capacity to trust and to feel safe. Morning chores were no longer a burden. They were a shared responsibility. She fed the animals with steady hands, tended the crops, and even learned to ride the horses with a growing sense of skill and freedom. The cowboy watched her progress with quiet pride, marveling at how resilient she was and how she had begun to reclaim her life. Evenings became a time of companionship rather than solitude. They shared meals by the fire, swapped stories, and laughed over small mistakes made during the day. The cowboy's once solitary life now carried warmth and laughter, and the girl began to understand what it meant to belong somewhere. She had found not just safety, but a home and a person whose care was unwavering. Their bond deepened naturally, not forced but earned through patience, trust, and shared experience. The cowboy, who had once believed that solitude was the only way to survive, began to recognize that companionship could bring strength rather than weakness. The girl, once broken by fear and neglect, began to understand that love and care did not have to come with strings or danger. They could be simple, quiet, and steadfast. The landscape of the ranch itself mirrored this transformation. The sun rose over fields that seemed brighter, over animals that moved more freely, over a home filled with warmth and hope. Even the sky seemed clearer, the wind gentler, and the air lighter. Life, once harsh and unforgiving, had begun to feel abundant with possibility. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, the girl and the cowboy stood on the porch, watching the colors stretch across the plains. She rested her hand on his arm, a simple gesture of connection, comfort, and trust. "I feel like I can stay here. Like I belong," she said softly, echoing the words she had spoken during those early, fragile days of trust. The cowboy nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "You do belong. Out here, this is your home now. And you're not alone any more, neither of us is." It was a promise and a recognition that the past, with all its pain and hardship, had shaped them, but it did not define their future. Together they had faced fear, danger, and loneliness, and emerged stronger, bound not just by circumstance, but by choice, care, and understanding. As twilight gave way to night, the cabin glowed with light, a beacon of warmth in the wide open plains. The girl and the cowboy sat together, the soft murmur of animals and the distant rustle of wind the only sounds beyond their shared space. Here they had forged a life together, not perfect, perhaps, but real, nurturing, and filled with hope. In the silence and the quiet companionship of the frontier, they had found something rare, a beginning that was truly new, a life that was theirs to build, side by side. And for the first time in years, both of them felt the deep, unshakable certainty that they were home.